All right, let's begin with the very basic question. What is virtue, according to Aristotle? All right. We've already determined that it somehow aligns with his concept of telos, or purpose, and it aligns with the notion of eudaimonia for humans, which for humans doesn't just mean the flourishing of the soul, but the development of, but also happiness. Right? So for Aristotle, to be happy, truly happy, means to be a virtuous character as well. And this is in part, importantly, because um, reason, unlike the other things, unlike the other things that living beings have to deal with, so, whether it be sights, desires, or just basic nutrition, the fulfillment of basic nutrition, is something that must be developed, right? It's not something that just comes naturally, right? It's a lifelong pursuit, developing your reason and your capacity for it appropriately. Well, to give a firmer definition of virtue, then, we can actually look towards Aristotle himself. In the Nicomachean Ethics, right, which is one of his two works on ethics, he provides the following definition, a definition where he says, virtue, then, is a state concerned with desires, lying in a means relative to us, this being determined by reason, and in the way in which a man of practical wisdom would determine it. Right? So there are 5 parts to this. Right? Just 5 parts. Right? And we can break this down into the following 5 parts. Right? The first bit, where we say virtue is, then is, right? And it tells us that it is a definition. The way that is functioning is as an is of definition versus an is of predication. What this means is that the everything what's on both sides of the is are complete descriptions of each other, right? So we can logically flip them around the is as though it were an equal sign without any loss of meaning. Just listen to the to the sentence if we rearrange it, right, in the other direction. So if we rearrange it in the other direction, it is a state concerned with choices lying in a means relative to us, this being determined by reason, and in the way in which a man of practical wisdom would determine it, then is virtue. Right? That's just as logically sound as saying virtue then is a state concerned with choices, lying in a means relative to us, this being determined by reason, and in the way in which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. They mean the exact same thing. There's no loss or change of meaning. Versus if it had been an is of predication, right, where what comes after the is just a partial description of what comes before it. And to flip them around is to change the meaning of the sentence. Right? Okay. So this is important for understanding one thing. This is everything you need to know about Aristotle's understanding of virtue is right here in this sentence, right there. And it's composed of the other 4 things. Right? The second one is that virtue is active and requires choice. Right? And the idea of it being active is particularly important. It's not something that you can just stumble upon, right? By being a passive observer in your own life. You might wind up doing the right thing, but if you're not making the active choice and exercising reason in making that choice, then you don't deserve any credit for it. It's not virtuous as a result, right? It's not a virtuous reflection of character. It's not a reflection of your character if it's not active. Um, and additionally, you can't be put into a situation where there are no choices or nothing but bad choices and do something and be called vicious for it, right? If the only course available to you is, to do X and X is good or X is bad, then it's neither virtuous nor vicious of you to do X, right? Choice has to be an important feature of uh, the activity for something to be virtuous. The third function is that virtue is a means between a mean between extremes, right? Um, and we'll develop on this a little bit later, right? But for the time being, let's move on to the last two aspects. The fourth aspect is that virtue requires reason to be used, right? It's not just choice, making a choice, it's actually thinking it through, right? And this connects virtue intimately to the fact that humans have the reasoning soul and that rational aspect of the soul. Our rational capacity is what allows for virtue in the first place. Therefore, virtue is predicated upon the exercise of reason. You have to think through the situation. You can't just blindly choose and still be praised for something when it comes out that you made the right choice. We don't say that was the correct choice in that case. If we know that the person just chose blindly, we say it was a lucky choice, right? And virtue cannot be a matter of luck, according to Aristotle. And then lastly, virtue requires practical wisdom. Uh, the Greek word that Aristotle uses for this is phronesis. And phronesis is a specific form of wisdom, right? It's one that's gained through experience, right? Uh, rather than sophos, which is the combination of knowing that and knowing how, right? Um, Phronesis is kind of akin to a sort of situational sensitivity that you only get by living through them, right? This is why virtue is something that we must develop over time. It doesn't just come naturally to us. More to the point, phronesis is the central virtue, right? Without phronesis in varying degree, without developing phronesis, you can't properly exercise any of the other virtues because phronesis governs over all of them, right? You can't determine what the courageous thing to do is in a situation if you haven't faced enough situations or to have learned what courage is, to have learned to judge it appropriately. And that judging it appropriately is phronesis, practical wisdom. Right? So it's an element that's there in every other virtue. Um, one last thing is Aristotle thinks that the virtues are connected also to a feeling, right? And it's rationalizing or thinking through that feeling and what it means um, as it applies to the situation that allows us to determine the proper course of action. For example, to go with one of the Platonic virtues we've already mentioned, um, courage is defined by a heat, right? Uh, it takes like a certain, like a fire to face adversity. And if you lack that feeling too much, it leads to cowardice. Right? Um, but also, if you have it in excess, then it leads to foolhardy action. And leads us back to the third point, the one that I said we'd address later. What it means for virtue to be a mean between extremes, right? It is a balancing act between two different extremes. According to Aristotle, a virtue exists between a vice of both excess and of deficiency, right? So for each virtue, there are two corresponding vices rather than one. It's not just pride and humility, it's pride, humility. It's humility, pride, and self uh, effacement or something like that, right? So it's for this reason that I personally call it like the Goldilocks theory of morality. Because think about the tale of Goldilocks, right? Tale of Goldilocks involves, a bunch of anthropomorphic bears leaving their house, right? Uh, Mama bear and Papa bear going to their day jobs and dropping baby bear off at bear care, while and why they live in the woods rather than in Zootopia with all the other animals, don't ask me. I don't know. Maybe they were exiled for some reason. But obviously they're, on their way somewhere for the day. And in this particular day, they left their meals half finished, right? And along comes this white bitch Goldilocks, because of course she's white. I've never met someone a person of color who lacked the sense, or who had the sufficient lack of sense to travel through the woods alone. Um, and she decides that, now's a great time when she sees this cabin in the woods, rather than do the sensible thing and run away, right? And continue on her way, minding her own business, get as far away from the fucking creepy cabin in the woods as possible. She does the, thing that only white people can do, looks at it and decides now's a great time to start her enterprising career as a criminal with a little bit of B&E, breaking and entering, for those of you who did not grow up, running with con artists like I did. Okay, so she does that. She breaks into their house, and then, she's tiny, and it takes a while for her to manage to get that crowbar jammed in the door and to break the lock that way. I mean, she's a novice at this. She doesn't understand that you should really place the crowbar right below the lock for best leverage. Not at the lock, but right below, best leverage. And I don't know why I'm giving you guys career advice for criminal pursuits. Ignore it. All right, and so all this work makes her hungry. She goes in and she sees the 3 bowls of porridge. If you don't know what porridge is, that's fine. It's basically, uh, the it's basically oatmeal, right, for lunch or brunch. And so she sits down at Papa Bear's seat first and tries some of Papa Bear's porridge, and it's piping hot, and it's too hot. And if porridge is too hot, if you've ever had porridge that's too hot, then you know that it's just burns your tongue, you can't taste anything, it's horrible, horrid experience. And so she moves on. She goes and sits at Mama Bear's porridge, and Mama Bear was the one who made the porridge, and she made her serving first, right? Thinking that she might be able to sit down and eat it before she before she had to make the other servings, but Baby Bear woke up and made a fuss and yada yada, right? So Mama Bear's porridge went cold, and when porridge gets cold, it gets gloopy, and all the flavors pop too much, right? If you put brown sugar in your porridge, and it gets cold, you taste nothing but the brown sugar. And the texture becomes unbearable when porridge gets cold. And then so she goes, ugh, it's not enough heat to be a sufficient meal, to be a good meal. So Goldilocks goes and sits at Baby Bear's, and she tries it, and it's just right. It's the perfect amount of heat. It's not too hot, it's not burning her mouth and drowning out the flavors, and it's not so cold as to make the texture the most notable thing. It all exists in that perfect balance, and God, I'm making myself hungry here. All right. So that's what virtue is. It's the mean between the two extremes. The vice of excess, too much heat. The vice of deficiency, too little heat. Right? baby bear's porridge is just right. That's what the virtue is. It's just right. All right. So this is why I call it the Goldilocks theory. Um, Lastly, I want to go kind of quickly over some of the moral. So Aristotle, quick side note, divides the virtues into the intellectual virtues, the virtues of the mind and spirit, and the moral virtues, the ones that have to do explicitly with um, our interactions with others. Right? Since we're so I want to go over the moral virtues with you. He gives five, right? Five main moral virtues, right? We have, of course, phronesis, which is technically an intellectual virtue, but uh, since wisdom also applies to, the exercise of wisdom applies to moral situations as well, it bleeds over where the others are kind of strictly either an intellectual virtue or a moral one. So phronesis is the virtue, and the vice of deficiency for wisdom happens to be simplicity. Not stupidity, but simplicity. Looking at things as too black and white, not considering, not thinking them through. Right? Um, and, because situations tend to be a bit more nuanced than we give them credit for. And then the vice of excess is going to be cunning or arrogance, where we exercise the virtue too much for personal gain. Right? We become so focused in on our own, trapped in our own sense of wisdom, that we stop being wise. We stop looking at all the relevant factors and instead start using it for self gain, which inevitably comes to bite us in the butt. Courage, we already went over. Too little courage leads to cowardice. Too much courage, right? Too much of that feeling of heat without exercising, appropriate judgment leads to foolhardy decisions, right? Brash, bullheadedness. Then there's temperance. You'll notice a lot of these are much like the uh, the Platonic virtues. Once again, right? So temperance, moderation, and moderation will mean different things for different people, right? The reformed alcoholic, who just the moment that alcohol touches their lips, they lose all sense of self-control. For them, exercising moderation means just complete abstinence from that particular indulgence. But for the person who isn't that sort of extreme version of alcoholic, then moderation would be knowing how many beers how many beers or glasses of wine or whatever before you start getting out of sorts, like really out of sorts, right? Um, so the vice of deficiency for temperance is going to be insensibility, right? If you don't exercise temperance enough, then what you wind up doing is you literally do something until you're insensate. If you've ever been hungry, right, and you've stuffed your face until like you just cannot eat anymore, it winds up being painful. Like you physically come to be in pain. Um, it dulls and blocks out the other senses, right? Thus, insensibility. Right? And the same thing with drinking. If you get drunk enough, like you can break your foot and not even realize it because you've so dulled yourself to to anything but the feeling of being drunk, right? Uh, so to be insensate uh, in this sense is to have been overrun by one particular feeling, to let it consume you, to have let the desire consume you in some way. The vice of excess, by comparison, is going to be intemperance or prudishness, right? It's going to it's going to be exercising too much temperance, such that, you deny yourself pleasures, right? And you become really uptight about things. Um, So, like, there's nothing wrong with a drink or two, so long as it's not a problem for you, right? And there's no reason to deny yourself that on occasion as a result. Then we have liberality, which is a virtue with regard to, we might think of it as generosity, but it's sort of the meeting point between generosity and gregariousness, being friendly, uh, as it applies to how we make use of our wealth, of what we have, right? Both in terms of wealth and time, and also in terms of like possessions, right? Meanness or greed is going to be the vice of deficiency. If we don't exercise enough liberality, then we're going to be Scrooge-like. And then lavishness, whether it's giving more than we can afford or spending more on ourselves than we can afford, right, is going to wind up being the vice of excess. Right? To be excessively liberal with our own means essentially means that we deplete ourselves of them. And then finally, there's justice, right? And justice is one that Aristotle explores in more depth in his Politics. I will say for now, it's kind of uh, this notion for him of uh, gain and loss under the law. Like justice is a matter of the application of the law, right? One who gains unfairly under the law has, has exceeded the bounds of justice, and one who loses things unfairly under the law has fallen under, fallen uh, away from, from the sight of justice, right? So justice is a social virtue. Um, much more than any of the other moral virtues, which tend to be individual. So again, it's like Plato in that respect. All right, that's all.